Hey everyone, this is a piece from the book Mapping the New Left Antisemitism, the Fathom Essays, edited by Alan Johnson. The piece is titled Left Alternatives to Left Antisemitism, a conversation between Alan Johnson and Philip Spencer. Part 1. The equivocations of Enlightenment Universalism and the two souls of the left. Alan Johnson says, in Antisemitism and the Left, the book you co-authored with the late Robert Fine, you point out that, quote, historically there has been no shortage either of anti-Semitism or of opposition to anti-Semitism within the left tradition, end quote. Let's conclude this collection of Fathom Essays, which has been all about the former, by looking more closely at the latter and at some of the exemplary figures who offer resources for a specifically left-wing opposition to contemporary left anti-Semitism. Let's begin with the Enlightenment. You and Robert argued that left anti-Semitism has its roots in that version of 18th century Enlightenment universalism, which cast the Jews as the bad, quote, other, end quote, to universalism, hence is, quote, reactionary, end quote. As you put it, the Jews were framed as the, quote, personification of a particularism opposed to the universal, end quote. Or as the, quote, personification of a false universalism concealing Jewish self-interest, end quote. I think the key insight of your book is that only when today's left-wingers break from that framing, seeing plain how it has misshaped the left itself, can they recognize and settle accounts with left anti-Semitism. And Philip Spencer says, indeed, two main forms of universalism emerged in the Enlightenment. One was inclusionary and gave more and more people recognition as fellow human beings entitled to the same rights as everyone else. The other defined the universal in opposition to various designated groups that were identified as somehow not deserving. The Jews were one such group, told to change their purported behavior if they wanted to become full members of enlightened society. Anti-Semitic tropes rooted in older Christian and Islamic anti-Semitism were re-articulated within a universalist frame of reference, constructing a supposed, quote, Jewish question, end quote, which has persisted in various forms to this day for a significant section of the left. Sorry, there's a footnote and I gotta find it. One second. Here we are. Footnote. David Nirenberg's Anti-Judaism 2013, which showed conclusively how at times certain versions of each religion, both of which saw themselves as universalist, cast Jews as their essential and denigrated other. End of footnote. In the latter part of the 19th century, in the socialist Second International, it was assumed that by many that holding on to a Jewish identity was incompatible with adherence to the socialist version of universalism. In the communist, quote, Third International that emerged after the Russian Revolution, you can see a similar approach, only now the universalism was seen as being embodied in the Soviet state. A section of the left, to put it at its simplest, believed that Jews failed the test of emancipation if they did not abandon their loyalties to their fellow Jews, reject their traditions and beliefs, and forget the injustices inflicted upon them. These injustices were crucially all now deemed to be in the past. If anti-Semitism did continue to threaten from time to time, it could only be from those seeking to turn back the clock, i.e. from the reactionary right, never the left. So we see certain tropes recur repeatedly in the articulation of anti-Semitic discourse in the 19th and 20th century left. that Jews are only loyal to each other, that they place their own interests in opposition to those of the wider society, that they hate and despise non-Jews, that they cheat and exploit them whenever they can, that they exaggerate their misfortunes for their own advantage, and cling to outworn beliefs and practices. In the Soviet Union and the wider communist movement that was enthralled to it for decades, Jews were attacked for being disloyal, albeit on two quite contradictory grounds. Either they were, quote, rootless cosmopolitans, end quote, and so not proper patriots, or they were exactly the opposite, nationalists, parenthesis, Zionists, end parenthesis, loyal to another country, a reprise of the catch-22 the Enlightenment had all imposed on Jews. Fortunately, this understanding of universalism has never been the only one on the left. There have always been those who have not singled out Jews in this negative way, but instead proposed a universalism which includes Jews and Jewish peoplehood, recognized the contributions that Jews make to society and to humanity, and who have viewed an attack on Jews as an attack on society and on humanity itself. Part 2. The Ambivalences of Karl Marx and Their Consequences. Alan Johnson. I think we disagree about Karl Marx. You have argued Marx is, quote, a key resource for recovering a tradition of critical thought that repudiates, quote, left antisemitism, end quote, end quote. I don't agree, holding to what you call in your book the, quote, disparaging view, end quote, of Marx. Apart from the slew of anti-Semitic statements in his private letters and journalism, I read his 1844 essay, quote, on the Jewish question, end quote, as a communist version of that bad Enlightenment universalism which excludes disfavored groups. In pages that anti-Semites have quoted ever since, Marx identified the Jews' haggling, huckstering, greed, unspiritual materialism, and contempt for man as the basis for identifying his solution to the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, communism. Here is the worst of it. Quote, what is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical needs, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly God? Money, ... An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, would make the Jew impossible. ... The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because the Jew has acquired financial power, but also because through him, and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. ... Money is the zealous God of Israel, in face of which no other God may exist. Money degrades all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. ... The bill of exchange is the real God of the Jew. His God is only an illusory bill of exchange. ... The chimerical nationality of the Jews is the nationality of the merchant, of the man of money in general, end quote. Marx. I think one has to work really hard not to see this as a combination of crass anti-Semitic stereotyping and a communist version of bad Enlightenment universalism. Judaism, Jewishness, and Jewish peoplehood, which are granted no positive value at all, are to be dissolved in the solvent of the universal communist proletariat. This idea that the disappearance of Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood is a condition for a marker of human progress has been one key driver of left anti-Semitism ever since. As Norman Garris highlighted in his Fathom essay, Alibi Antisemitism, of 2013, which is on this channel, it has been one reason so much of the left has been willing to offer Jewish people only individual rights as individual citizens, not collective recognition as a people or acceptance of their statehood. Because as a collective, Jews are always seen as suspect. And then Philip Spencer says, I don't think there's any point in denying the unpleasantness of some of Marx's language or to put Marx on a pedestal. He wasn't heir to precisely the ambivalences of Enlightenment universalism, so it should be no surprise that a hostile attitude to Jews can be found in the way Marx sometimes writes. That essay, however, was written before Marx had discovered the idea of capitalism itself. He talks a lot about money and haggling, but not about accumulation or exploitation. This matters because it is one of the features of leftist antisemitism that is too based on a superficial view of economy and society, and then, from this distorted perspective, makes Jews responsible for all that is supposedly going wrong. The key question is, what contribution did Marx make to thinking about antisemitism and universalism on the left? Marx's essay was a critical response to an anti-Semite on the left, Bruno Bauer. Bauer was one of those who believed that, quote, the, end quote, Jews had failed the conditions of emancipation. What was distinctive about Marx's response was his insistence that singling out Jews was absolutely wrong. There were no grounds whatsoever for attributing any of the grave flaws of modern society to Jews. All the comments he makes about Jews, parenthesis, however ugly the phrasing, end parenthesis, are about features of contemporary society which need to be changed, but those features are not there because of the Jews, and they will not be solved by the exclusion of Jews. On the contrary, Marx insists repeatedly that Jews should have the same rights as everyone else. What is really needed, he thinks, is something much more fundamental, a radical change in how society itself is organized. Crucially, from Marx's perspective, there is no, quote, Jewish question, end quote, to be solved. No problem posed by the presence or activity of Jews as such, but there is an anti-Semitism question, which is exactly the opposite. If Marx does not explicitly point this out, that is because political anti-Semitism had not emerged as a significant political force, although it was stirring. Those who came after cannot hide behind this as an excuse. Marx's effective demolition of the notion of a, quote, Jewish question, end quote, seems to me to be a fundamental step forward for the left, but not a path that everyone has followed. Far too often there has been a disturbing tendency to go back to exactly the argument that Bauer put forward and Marx demolished. Lars Fischer has shown how this was a very strong temptation for very many Marxists almost immediately after Marx's death. Then Alan Johnson says, let's move on. I think useful resources for today's left can also be found in a tradition that runs from Friedrich Engels and Eleanor Marx through to Edward Bernstein. Robert Wistrich's book from, quote, Robert Wistrich's book, From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel, is the best overview of the history of left antisemitism. He claims that Engels overcame his personal prejudices when faced with rising tide of political anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe, including on the left, and so produced, quote, one of the most unequivocal repudiations of anti-Semitism to be found in modern socialist journalism, end quote. I think Wistrich has written books on Trotsky, I'm not sure. Sorry. According to Wikipedia, Robert Wistrich lived from 1945 to 2015. Robert Wistrich was a scholar of anti-Semitism, considered the world's foremost authorities on anti-Semitism. Erich Neuberger, professor of European and Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Robert Wistrich was also the head of the university's Vital Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism. Robert Wistrich considered anti-Semitism, quote, the longest hatred, end quote, and viewed anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism's latest incarnation. According to Scott Urry, quote, more than any other scholar, Wistrich has helped integrate traditional Zionist interpretations of Jewish history, society, and fate into the study of anti-Semitism. End quote. Other researchers have reproduced much of his work without questioning its founding assumptions. So that's Wikipedia. And the book From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel. The description of the book says, From Ambivalence to Betrayal is the first study to explore the transformation in attitudes on the left toward the Jews, Zionism, and Israel since the origin of European socialism in the 1840s until the present. The path-breaking synthesis reveals a striking continuity in negative stereotypes of Jews, contempt for Judaism, and negation of Jewish national self-determination, from the days of Karl Marx to the current left-wing intellectual assault on Israel. World-renowned expert on the history of anti-Semitism, Robert S. Wistrich, provides not only a powerful analysis of how and why the left emerged as a spearhead of anti-Israel sentiment, but also new insights into the wider involvement of Jews in radical movements. There are fascinating portraits of Marx, Moses Hess, Bernard Lazara, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and other Jewish intellectuals, alongside analysis of the darker face of socialist and communist anti-Semitism. The closing section eloquently exposes the degeneration of leftist anti-Zionist critiques into a novel form of, quote, anti-racist, end quote, racism. Back to the text. Robert, this is Alan Johnson speaking still. Robert Wistrich's book, From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel, is the best overview of the history of left anti-Semitism. He claims that Engels overcame his personal prejudices when faced with the rising tide of political anti-Semitism in late 19th century Europe, including on the left, and so produced, quote, one of the most unequivocal repudiations of anti-Semitism to be found in modern socialist journalism, end quote. Wistrich. Famously, when the socialist and anti-Semite Eugen Düring became influential over German social democracy, Engels entered the list against him with his book Anti-Düring. Less famously, that book was sharply critical of pseudo-progressive anti-Semitism. Marx's daughter Eleanor was very close to Engels. She was also the only Marx to embrace Jewish peoplehood and particularism, and to balance it with her universalist commitments, a balance that seems to be found in every left-wing refusal of left anti-Semitism. Quote, I am a Jewess, end quote, Eleanor Marx would proclaim in the face of Judaism. Parenthesis, Sidney Hook thought those four words are the perfect riposte to her father's 1844 essay, end parenthesis. The German social democrat Edward Bernstein, who rode from Beachy Head together with Eleanor to scatter Engels' ashes out in the sea, praised her for exactly this quality, noting that she, quote, did not allow herself to be led astray by her deep-rooted proletarian class feeling whenever the Jew was oppressed as a Jew, but declared herself for the oppressed irrespective of class affiliation, end quote. Bernstein, found in Wistrich, 2012. According to Wistrich, Bernstein, quote, stands out as a maverick among the leading German Jewish socialists of his generation, end quote, because Bernstein refused to, quote, expunge, deny, or repudiate his Jewishness, end quote, and because, quote, he rejected any simplistic identification of Jews with capitalism, end quote. Wistrich went on, quote, one cannot find in his writings any residue of the Schacher, parenthesis, huckster, and parenthesis, stereotype, popularized by the young Karl Marx, end quote. And he, quote, Bernstein, quote, never called on his co-religionists to abandon their Jewish affiliations in order to become, quote, humanly emancipated, end quote, or to benefit from progress and enlightenment, end quote. Wistrich. I think this is what the left needs today, an understanding of universalism that has space for, indeed, respect for Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood, affiliations, identities, and traditions. For me, that has to mean support for, quote, two states for two peoples, end quote, as the democratic program for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not chanting, quote, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, end quote, which for those who know the code is a call for genocide. In 1898, Bernstein wrote that, quote, "It is a categorical imperative for me to be a, quote, Philosemite, end quote, in the face of all anti-Semitism, end quote. Never a Zionist as such, quote, I feel myself too German to become a Zionist, end quote," Bernstein said. Bernstein became convinced that a Jewish national home in Palestine was desperately needed. Bernstein insisted that, quote, "Cosmopolitan sentiment is not identical with anti-national or anti-patriotic conviction. It is compatible with recognition of individual nations as legitimate members of the great organism of civilized mankind with their own needs and interests," end quote. In 1928, the left-wing Jewish movement in Palestine, how do you say that? Pola Zion? Where am I?
Poale Zion. Poale Zion.
Poale Zion? I don't know if that's right. That seems weird, but maybe that's how I say it. Poale Zion. Now that you see it, I see a different spelling of it. It looks actually correct. Poale Zion, meaning, quote, workers of Zion, end quote, was a movement of Marxist Zionist Jewish workers found in various cities of Poland, Europe, and the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century after the Bund rejected Zionism in 1901. In 1928, so back to the text. In 1928, the left-wing Jewish movement in Palestine, which is
Poale Zion.
Poale Zion, sent Bernstein a telegram addressed to, quote, a true friend of the Jewish worker in Palestine, end quote. I think we can and must be critical of Bernstein's views on imperialism while agreeing with Wistrich's conclusion that Bernstein gave us a glimpse of what a synthesis of, quote, the Jewish cultural heritage with neo-Kantian German philosophy and the socialist vision of human brotherhood, end quote, might look like as a response to rising anti-Semitism. And Philip Spencer says, I certainly think it is important to recall all this. It is a crucial part of the history of the left that Engels and Eleanor Marx and Bernstein were quite explicit at times in their opposition to anti-Semitism. And it has to be remembered that in Eleanor Marx's case, she was directly combating anti-Semitism on the left too. In her fury with those who refused to support Dreyfus, parenthesis, and quite a lot of people on the left refused, a fact which is often forgotten, end parenthesis. The case of Bernstein raises important issues about revising one's ideas in the face of new evidence. When Bernstein was developing his main revisionist ideas and being attacked for supposedly betraying Marx, it does not seem to me that the question of anti-Semitism was particularly significant for him. But Bernstein began to think much more seriously during the war when the anti-Semitism of the German state began to become much more ominous with the so-called Jews census. With the so-called, quote, Jews census, end quote, end parenthesis. According to Wikipedia, the Jew census, or Judenzählung, was a measure instituted by the German Oberste Heeresleitung, OHL, in October 1916 during the upheaval of World War I. Designed to confirm accusations of the lack of patriotism among German Jews, the census disproved the charges. But the Jew census's results were not made public. However, the Jew census's figures were published in an anti-Semitic brochure. Jewish authorities, who themselves had compiled statistics that considerably exceeded the figures in the brochure, were denied access to government archives and informed by the Republican Minister of Defense that the brochure's contents were correct. In the atmosphere of growing anti-Semitism, many German Jews saw, quote, the Great War, end quote, as an opportunity to prove their commitment to the German homeland. Back to the text. Footnote. In 1916, the Prussian army ordered a census of Jews serving in the army. The implication was that Jews were not doing their bit for the war effort, the exact opposite of the case. Approximately 100,000 German Jews fought, 18,000 died, and 12,000 won the Iron Cross during World War II. End footnote. Of course, Bernstein did not live to see the Nazis come to power, but seeing what they were already threatening, he had come, as you say, to revise his opposition to the idea that Jews needed their own national homeland. New section. Rosa Luxemburg and German Socialism. Alan Johnson says, in your view, we should add Rosa Luxemburg to this better left-wing tradition. Can you say why? Wistrich complained of a, quote, unpleasant streak of contempt for Jewry, end quote, in Luxemburg, pointing to Luxemburg's 1917 response. When told of the pogroms in Russia, quote, why do you come to me with your special Jewish sorrows, end quote. Are there not weaknesses as well as undoubted strengths in her view that, quote, for the followers of Marx, as for the working class, the Jewish question as such does not exist, just as the, quote, Negro question or the, quote, yellow peril, end quote, does not exist. From the standing of the working class, the Jewish question, ... is a question of racial hatred as a symptom of social reaction, which to a certain extent is an indivisible part of all societies based on class antagonism, end quote. And especially in Luxemburg's statement that Marx had, quote, for the first time removed the Jewish question from the religious and racial sphere and gave it a social foundation, proving that is what is usually described and persecuted as, quote, Judaism, end quote, is nothing but the spirit of huckstering and swindle, which appears in every society where exploitation reigns, end quote. Quoted in Wistrich. Is this not, alongside a rejection of anti-Semitism, an example of the very stereotyping and bad Enlightenment universalism that was helping to generate anti-Semitism in the first place? And Philip Spencer says, Luxemburg is important at a number of levels. One is that, like Marx, she did not accept that there was a, quote, Jewish question, end quote, to be answered. Parenthesis, I am indebted to Lars Fischer for this insight, end parenthesis. The crucial part of Luxemburg's quote above says this explicitly, even if Luxemburg seems to have go back on this. I would say this is an example of a struggle going on inside Luxemburg, as we saw with earlier Enlightenment thinkers. But even in this moment of regression, she says that what is supposed to be, quote, Judaism, end quote, is actually to do with exploitation, which is what Marx was also saying. Like Marx, she is giving a hostage to fortune in even using the term, quote, Judaism, end quote, so I am not holding her up as perfect. What we need to do here, as with Marx, is to build on what Rosa Luxemburg was saying and go further down the path he and she laid out. In Luxemburg's case, far more than so to Marx, Luxemburg had to deal directly with a growing and serious anti-Semitic threat that she experienced herself, not only from the German right in Germany, but from a section, parenthesis, the dominant section, end parenthesis, of the Polish left. Luxemburg's response to it had nothing in common with those who thought philo-Semitism was a more serious problem, or that there might be some kind of rational kernel to anti-Semitic, quote, thinking, end quote. See Fisher, 2007. I think Rosa Luxemburg's position was not, at that time, so different from Bernstein's, But Luxemburg's cosmopolitanism had a more fundamental aspect than Bernstein's, which set Luxemburg apart from the rest of the left in a way that has serious import for our own thinking about the left and anti-Semitism. Luxemburg did not think that any forms of nationalism were progressive, so she did not single out Jewish nationalism for opprobrium. Again, this has contemporary echoes, given how much of the anti-Zionist left today has adopted the obviously anti-Semitic position that only Jewish nationalism is illegitimate. Her cosmopolitanism provides the basis for a principled response to those I think only masquerade as cosmopolitans in order to mount their attack on Zionism. I think this is actually super important because this is the position that I personally would hold, right? Like some people who criticize the anti-Semitism of anti-Zionism or criticize anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic are like pro-nationalist. So for instance, like I have things on here from Michael Walzer, who's more of like a social democratic philosopher kind of guy. And I think, maybe I don't want to speak too strongly, but I think the other guy that I've read pieces from, God, I can't think of his name right now. Not Michael Walzer. Mitchell Cohen, I think his name is. Maybe I'm misspeaking for Mitchell Cohen, but they kind of speak as like nationalism as like a positive and progressive thing, or not inherently reactionary in some like deeper level. It's a progressive and democratic, right? They kind of have like a republic. They kind of ascribe to a like a social republican form of nationalism, right? And that's kind of their justification for Israel. Whereas if you listen to people from like the anti-Deutsch, those people, or from that, disagree with anti-Zionism from an anti-nationalist perspective, right? Like they think, generally speaking, I mean I can't speak for all of them, but generally the feel I get from people like Joachim Brun and Stefan Grigat and other people that I've read that are affiliated with the anti-Deutsche, they have the idea kind of like that in a way that like the evils of capitalism or like the social the destructive qualities of capitalism are kind of like concretized in anti-Semitism and like Jews are given the face of social dislocation, right? And exploitation and alienation and all of those things that are kind of associated with the impersonal domination, the impersonal class rule that takes place in capitalist society. And it's a false concretization of a confusing and nebulous social world that is nonetheless destructive, but in a highly impersonalized, shadowy kind of way, right? And then the Jews are kind of like falsely concretized as the like causal mechanism of that. In the anti-Deutsch take that further, and I think this is why their kind of critique kind of pertains more to Israel. I mean, pertains more to anti-Semitism in the contemporary form. Is that they criticize nationalism as inherently tied to the inherently exclusionary and like exploitative and all and what's the word? Nasty. They don't like nationalism. Okay, basically that sounds, that's a dumb way of putting it, but in a similar way that maybe Rosa Luxemburg would also think of nationalism as particularly disgusting. But what they say, the problems with nationalism, and this is kind of like, I'm sure there's a more sophisticated way to put this, a more complicated way to put this, but the problems of nationalism as such are concretized and projected and focused in on the problems associated with one particular state, and that being the only Jewish state, which makes up a very small portion of the entire globe, and makes up a very small portion of the Middle East, but is held out for special extreme scrutiny as a regressive and nasty form of nationalism, whereas other nationalisms are either viewed as progressive or just viewed as neutral, right? So for them, it would be like within like a lot of fascist discourse, right? Especially, maybe not like, I don't know, like other forms of, extreme, say for instance, extreme laissez-faire capitalist kind of people, but like the nationalist, like fascist right, their idea is that there's like the good, like real economy of like hard-working producers who are tied to particular places, and have like fidelity for the places they live. And then there's like the bad capitalism, which is like international and cosmopolitan and like associated with like, I don't know, coastal, morally debauched cities, well, at least in the United States it is. And so there's like a good capitalism and a bad capitalism, and part of that kind of like truncated critique of capitalism, the anti-Semitism fits very, very well into that narrative. And you could say a similar thing, I think the anti-Deutsch would say, you could say something similar about the nation state. That the nation state, the suffering, the human suffering of the nation state, is concretized, falsely concretized by the anti-Zionists, by anti-Zionism, as the problems with a particular state, right? Because, when people, the flag that they're waving, if you're like waving like the Palestinian flag, or you're advocating, whether you're advocating for a two-state solution or a one-state solution or whatever, you're advocating usually for some form of nationalism, whether or not you'd like to say so or not. So, like, I guess, like, this exclusive focus on the Jewish nation and the Jewish state is comparable in some capacity to a narrow focus on Jewish, at least the symbol, the kind of like the obsession of like the image of like the Jewish capitalist, right, as manifested in certain wingnut far left people, and then generally on the far right. So I think that for me personally, it's like I do think that like there is problems with Zionism, and I do think there's problems with the nation state as a form, but I think it would be a mistake, and it is a mistake, to single out Israel as the like most extreme form or something of what's wrong with like the nation state, or like the most extreme form of national particularism or something like that, or ethnic particularism, as if the whole impetus behind Zionism was a reaction to the exclusionary nature of other nationalisms, right? At least that's my understanding, right? Is that like Jews were not viewed as part of any of the places that they actually existed in, right? And especially with the rise of nationalism, like, maybe you wouldn't say that about past, when nationalism was like not so much of a prominent feature of political discourse. But with the rise of nationalism, it usually had and that's why like extreme right nationalism almost universally has an extremely anti-Semitic component, because Jews are not viewed as part of the place. So instead of having like this, overall critique of nationalism, they have a very narrow critique of nationalism, which exclusively focuses on Jewish nationalism. I don't know if any of that came to a point, but it was kind of like scattered notes that I'm just putting on the page. But I think I'm just saying that from a personal level, I agree with Luxemburg as a resource for the critique of anti-Semitism, as opposed to people who, as a resource for the critique of contemporary anti-Semitism, as opposed to people who are view the nation state a little more warmly than I do. Anyway, back to the text. I think Luxemburg, this is Philip Spencer speaking, I think Rosa Luxemburg's position was not at that time so different from Bernstein's, but Luxemburg's cosmopolitanism had a more fundamental aspect than his, which set her apart from the rest of the left in a way that has serious import for our own thinking about the left and anti-Semitism. Luxemburg did not think that any forms of nationalism were progressive, so she did not single out Jewish nationalism for opprobrium. Again, this is contemporary echoes, given how much of the anti-Zionist left today has adopted the obviously anti-Semitic position that only Jewish nationalism is illegitimate. Her cosmopolitanism provides the basis for a principled response to those who I think only masquerade as cosmopolitans in order to mount their attack on Zionism. I'm going to copy that down. That's going in the note, the pile of collected greatest hits I'm compiling. Well, it looks like my internet's not going to cooperate, so I guess that's lost forever. It can certainly be argued that even Luxemburg's cosmopolitanism does not offer enough solidarity to Jews, and I think, as Norman Garris pointed out, parenthesis, and he is very sympathetic to her as I am, end parenthesis, that there is something missing in her seemingly dismissive comment you cite about special Jewish sorrows. But some remember, when she said this, before those sorrows became not so much special as unprecedentedly acute. Remember, before those sorrows became not so much special as unprecedentedly acute. I do not think it is a stance she would have continued to adopt it, had she lived as long as Bernstein, and certainly not had she witnessed the Holocaust. I say this because there is another facet of Luxemburg's thought, which in my view offers the contemporary left important resources to improve its often parenthesis threadbare end parenthesis thinking about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Part 3. The Holocaust, Barbarism, and the Left. Philip Spencer says, "Let me put it this way. Luxemburg was aware that things can go catastrophically wrong. In the so-called Junius pamphlet, a quite brilliant piece written during the slaughter of the First World War, Luxemburg went back to Engels' suggestion that if socialism did not replace capitalism, then society might regress to a state of barbarism. The term Luxemburg used to describe the incipient barbarism of the First World War, destruction of culture, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, the construction of a vast cemetery, seemed to me actually to be much better applied to the Holocaust. I'm not arguing that Luxemburg foresaw the Holocaust as such. She was not a prophet, but she, like Trotsky, had an acute sense that something really dreadful was on the horizon for humanity as a whole. While Trotsky is distinguished by his awareness that barbarism was highly likely to be visited on Jews specifically, predicting the Holocaust in 1938, there was a profound and widespread reluctance on the part of many on the left to respond to the threat posed to Jews by the Nazis as they were mobilizing in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when they began to use the state power they had acquired to attack Jews, and then when the extermination began. While Trotsky is distinguished by his awareness that barbarism was highly likely where am I? At each stage, a significant section of the left downplayed anti-Semitism, fearing it would lose the left's support. And this is something that few on the radical left today are prepared to acknowledge. See Banquier, 2000, and Hirsh, 1995. Rather than facing the dismal reality of this experience, many take refuge in the claim that the radical left, parenthesis, by which I mean primarily the communists, but not only them, end parenthesis, has always been, quote, anti-fascist, end quote. Well, first, that is not even true, as the Nazi-Soviet pact forcibly delivered many Jews to Hitler. Alan Johnson says, Stalin even forcibly deported German communist Jews who had taken refuge in the Soviet Union. Stalin sent them to their deaths in the hands of Hitler. Until Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, communist parties around the world denounced the war of the Allies as, quote, imperialist, unquote, and refused to support it. Parenthesis, Bornstein and Richardson, 1982, end parenthesis. Footnote. Bornstein and Richardson note the behavior of this Communist Party Great Britain leader, Rajani Palma, during the Nazi-Soviet pact. Quote, by laying all the blame for the continuation of the war on the shoulders of the British government, he, had converted the Communist Party into an instrument of Hitler's propaganda in the country, end quote. When Hitler invaded the Low Countries, the Communist Party of Great Britain ran the headline, quote, Britain spreads the war to Holland, end quote. School students took to greeting known communist teachers with mock Nazi salutes. Only when Hitler turned on Stalin on the 22nd of June 1941 did the supposedly, quote, anti-fascist, end quote, British Stalinists turn on Hitler and support the Allied war effort. Back to the text. Communist parties were very selective, quote, anti-fascist, end quote. The needs of Stalin's foreign policy always came first. And Philip Spencer says, indeed, but the other point I want to make is that anti-fascism and solidarity with Jews, when they are attacked, are not the same thing. But the other point I want to make is that anti-fascism and solidarity with Jews, when they are attacked, are not the same thing. The Holocaust is more than a question of fascism, which is of course always racist and intrinsically violent. The Holocaust was a radical genocide, in which the aim was to kill all the Jews wherever the Nazis could find them, as an end in itself, not as a means to another end. It involved the transformation of a process for producing commodities, bracket, the factory system, end bracket, into one, parenthesis, in the death camps, end parenthesis, that produced only ashes. Previous anti-Semites might have had fantasies about getting rid of Jews in a particular place, but not globally and not forever. If this project had been successful, it would have fundamentally altered humanity itself. For a post-Holocaust and universalist left, solidarity with Jews in the face of this threat is an existential question, just as the genocidal assault is for the Jews themselves. The Holocaust posed very sharply the question of the place Jews have in the version of universalism the left adopts. If the Jews are the, quote, other, end quote, of the universal, if they have no secure place in the universal, then a lack of solidarity is probably inevitable. Later, there was the Soviet regime's insistence that the, quote, Great Patriotic War, end quote, was not fought to save Jews. A stance adopted right across the resistance in Europe too, even in France. See Blattman and Poznansky, 2011. Footnote. Blattman and Poznansky tell us that the communist underground press effectively organized a, quote, total silence, even when an anti-Semitic propaganda campaign was launched, and even when it directly targeted the resistance, Throughout the occupation, the resistance spared no effort to prove that its members had not signed up to the goal of defending the Jews, end quote. End footnote. In each case, it was claimed that defending Jews would not be popular. Sometimes this went beyond being an excuse for inaction into something much more sinister, the instrumental adoption of anti-Semitism itself. Anti-Semitism was in Stalinism all the way through, from its origins in the initial campaign against Trotsky in 1923, through to the purges of the 1930s, from the brutal suppression of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and the murder of its leading activist very soon after the war, through to the appalling anti-Semitic show trials across Eastern Europe, some of which resulted in executions, and then on to the near genocidal assault begun on Jews in the Soviet Union in Stalin's last years, with the sustained assault on, quote, cosmopolitanism, end quote, and so-called, quote, doctor's plot, end quote. See Rubinstein and Naumov, 2001, and Brent and Naumov, 2003. Why did the Holocaust, at the center of which was a radicalized anti-Semitism, not make any on the left rethink? There remains to this day no sustained study of the Holocaust as what Marxists used to call a world historical event, something which fundamentally altered the course of human history. To think about anti-Semitism in and after the Holocaust, you have to think about it not as a secondary question, but as a primary question for socialists. As Hannah Arendt put it, the Holocaust was, quote, an attack on humanity carried out on the body of the Jewish people, end quote. If you eliminate a group, humanity would no longer be what it was. So from an inclusionary universalist point of view, the protection of Jews is not only a theoretical question, it is existential, to do with the existence of humanity itself. It is of course also existential for Jews, for whom what happens in the Holocaust changed everything. It made Zionism, which had not previously been the dominant political ideology among Jews globally, now unarguable. If one could protect the Jews, then they would have to do it themselves. The better section of the left has, to its great credit and to our considerable benefit, recognized this, albeit in different ways and at different levels, and it is crucial that we remind ourselves repeatedly of this other and continuing tradition. Part 4. Excavating a better left. Alan Johnson says, let's do that then. Four exemplary left-wing thinkers illustrate many of the qualities of that other, better left-wing tradition. Let's look more closely at Leon Trotsky, Theodor Adorno, Moshe Postone, and Norman Garris. First section. Leon Trotsky, the quote, Jewish nation will maintain itself for an entire epoch to come, end quote. Alan Johnson, whatever criticisms can be made of the Bolsheviks during the early years of the revolution, and I think there are a great many, the decision to appoint a Jew, Jacob Sverdlov, as the first president of the new Soviet Republic, has rightly been described as a, quote, act of courage, end quote, and a, quote, declaration of war against anti-Semitism, now identified with the counter-revolution, end quote. Wikipedia says Yakov Sverdlov lived from 1895 to 1919. Sverdlov was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician who served as chairman of the Secretariat of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks from 1918 until his death in 1919, and is chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee (head of state of the Russian SFSR) from 1917 until his death. Born in Nizhny Novgorod to a Jewish family active in revolutionary politics, Sverdlov joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1902 and supported Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction from 1903. Yakov Sverdlov was active in the Urals during the failed revolution of 1905 and over the next decade was subjected to constant imprisonment and exile. After the 1917 February Revolution overthrew the monarchy, Sverdlov returned to Petrograd and was appointed a secretary of the party's Central Committee. In his administrative capacity, Yakov Sverdlov played a key role in planning the October Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks came to power. In November 1917, Yakov Sverdlov was elected chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, the de facto head of state. Yakov Sverdlov worked to consolidate Bolshevik control of the new regime and supported the Red Terror campaign and de-Cossacization policies. Yakov Sverdlov played a major role in the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918 in persuading party members to support the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with the Central Powers that March, and in authorizing the execution of the Romanov family that July. In March 1919, Sverdlov died at age 33 during the Spanish flu and was buried in the Kremlin Wall necropolis. The city of Yekaterinburg (Sverdlovsk) and Theater Sverdlov Square in Moscow were named in Yakov Sverdlov's honor. Some historians regard the entire untimely deaths of prominent Bolsheviks, such as Yakov Sverdlov and Lenin, to have been key factors which facilitated the rise of Joseph Stalin to leader of the Soviet Union. As Yakov Sverdlov was a natural candidate for the position of party general secretary, to which Stalin was appointed in 1922. Back to the text. Whatever criticism can be made of the Bolsheviks during the early years of the revolution, this is Alan Johnson speaking again, I think there is a great many. The decision to appoint a Jew, Yakov Sverdlov, as the first president of the new Soviet Republic has rightly been described as a, quote, act of courage, and quote, a declaration of war against antisemitism, now identified with the counter-revolution, end quote. In July 1918, a decree was passed outlawing antisemitism, promising harsh measures against pogromists, and declaring antisemitism, quote, a mortal danger for the entire revolution, end quote. The result was that, quote, the party's leadership was widely identified as a Jewish gang, end quote. As a side note, two side notes. First side note is that you should check out, if you find this interesting, you should check out Brendan McGeever, who talks about anti-Semitism during the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, and he talks about particularly anti-Semitism in the Red Army. Especially, I think it's especially about in Ukraine, which had like a high peasant membership, and that I think somewhere between 5 and 10% of all pogroms during the Civil War were done by the Red Army, which obviously, 5 to 10% compared to the rest, which is all on the whites, like that's better, but it doesn't mean, it means that it was like a problem, like it was really like not just a problem, external problem, dealing with anti-Semitism as something that was just like of the whites, which is like, some people fail to acknowledge it pretty early on. Like, for instance, I believe that Lenin kind of had the idea like that a lot of people of like revolution will sweep away anti-Semitism, and is kind of confused, like didn't quite really understand the like, I guess like the certain like populist aspects of anti-Semitism, that it wasn't just something that was localized in like, say, like the nobility and the upper echelons of Tsarist society, but was something that was like kind of like as a cultural thing, is kind of like in the marrow of society at large. So check out, I think it's Brendan McGeever. He has work on the Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism website. He's a historian, but I think he's on that website. I think he's all over the internet. I think it's I think there's like audiobooks of him maybe on YouTube by another radical reading person like me. But what else was I going to say? The other thing that I don't actually know anything about was the abolition of the Jewish Labor Bund in like the early Bolshevik period. by the Bolsheviks. I can't really talk about it too much because I don't know, like even right then, I don't really know whether it voluntarily dissolved or whether it was forced to dissolve. But I know when it was dissolved, at least I've read in Eve Coleman's, one of Eve Coleman's pieces about left anti-Semitism. It talks about how, like, I guess, like, more assimilationist Jews, which would have been the Jews that were, like, in the Bolsheviks, right? Like, I don't think, like, Trotsky, for instance, gave, like, a rat's ass about Judaism or Jewishness or, like, anything like that. Not that he was entitled to, like, you know, like, you know, like, unlike a lot of people, I don't think, like, assimilation or something like that is, like, or the desire for assimilation or, like, is necessarily, I don't know, evil or something like that. But I think the more assimilationist elements of, you know, the radical Jewish left used propaganda that could be, at the very least, could be considered anti-Semitic in advocating for the dissolution of the Bund. I'm not sure if that's actually true. I haven't, like, you know, I have to see it a few times to have that kind of information corroborated. But about that particular topic, because usually when anti-Semitism, because of all these, you know, these very progressive measures that the Bolsheviks undertook, and pertaining to anti-Semitism, obviously it's a conflicted thing, and that's how it is in the left in general, right? Like, the left doesn't want to be anti-Semitic. It might be anti-Semitic, and the consequences of anti-Zionism might be anti-Semitic, but I really don't believe the left desires to be anti-Semitic, or actually thinks it's not like it's, like, lying when it says it's not anti-Semitic, like, at least in terms of how it regards the subject. But it's like, you know, there's so, like, within the early days of the Soviet state, there's contradictions in how it wants to deal with anti-Semitism. Anyway, Trotsky already knew about that and had fought against it. This is Alan Johnson speaking, still. Trotsky already knew about and had fought against Christian anti-Semitism and the Tsar-licensed Black Hundreds pogroms, about which he wrote powerfully in his book 1905. And Trotsky had written movingly about the anti-Semitic Beilis, quote, blood libel, end quote, trial in 1913. I was reading about this because reading about, look up the Beilis trial, I'm not going to look it up now because I already know what it is, but it's like a very fucking, like, creepy, like, backward ass, like, trial where, like, this Jewish guy was just kind of, like, I don't know, accused of, like, now I have to look it up. God damn you all. Yeah, he was accused, the Beilis trial. Menahem Mendel Beilis, who lived from 1874 to 1934, was a Russian Jew accused of ritual murder in Kiev in the Russian Empire in a notorious 1913 trial known as the Beilis trial or the Beilis affair. Although Menahem Mendel Beilis was eventually acquitted after a lengthy process, the legal process sparked international criticism of anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire. Menahem Beilis' story was fictionalized in Bernard Malamud's 1966 novel, The Fixer, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the U.S. National Book Award for Fiction. Back to the text. And Trotsky had written movingly about the anti-Semitic Beilis, quote, blood libel, end quote, trial in 1913. The 1917 revolution taught Trotsky that anti-Semitism was present among the revolutionary as well as the counter-revolutionary armies. Trotsky suffered right-wing anti-Semitic abuse from the white counter-revolutionaries and then, soon enough, left anti-Semitic abuse from the Stalinist counter-revolutionaries. About the latter, Trotsky said this in 1937, quote, "Of course we can close our eyes to the facts and limit ourselves to vague generalities about the equality and brotherhood of all races, but an ostrich policy will not advance us a single step, ... All serious and honest observers bear witness to the existence of anti-Semitism, not only of the old and hereditary, but also of the new, quote, Soviet, end quote, variety, end quote." Trotsky. In the 1930s, in the face of Nazism and Stalinism and that awful midnight of the century, I believe that was Victor Serge, quote, midnight of the century, when Trotsky, or not quote, but that's what it's like, that for midnight of the 20th century, kind of, I think is something that Serge says. In the 1930s, in the face of Nazism and Stalinism, in that awful midnight of the century, when Trotsky was in exile and, quote, on the planet without a visa, end quote, Trotsky managed to carry out a, quote, global revision, end quote, of the classical Marxist approach to anti-Semitism that was so radical that he alone on the left predicted the Shoah and embraced a kind of proto-Zionism before his death in 1940. This notion of a, quote, global revision, end quote, I take from Enzo Traverso, whose intellectual history, the Marxist and the Jewish question, argue that Trotsky was, though not systematic, quote, the most profound analysis. Trotsky's was, though not systematic, quote, the most profound analysis of anti-Semitism that Marxist thought produced in the interwar period, end quote. Traverso. I think I'm going to read that book soon. I'm going to assume you know who Enzo Traverso is and know something about that book. It's a history of the Jewish question between 1844 and 1944. I think it's like evenly 100 years. Three interrelated qualities of Trotsky's thought made this global revision possible. First, Trotsky's lifelong political practice of solidarity with persecuted Jews. Second, his serious intellectual engagement with the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, tracing its long history and changing forms, parenthesis, religious, secular, right and left, end parenthesis, as well as its utility for political leaders of right and left, and its sometimes utterly irrational and radically violent character. Trotsky wrote in the book 1905 of how the anti-Jewish pogroms of the year satisfied perpetrators, quote, drunk on the smell of blood, end quote, parenthesis, which as Norman Garris observed is not a well-known Marxist category, end parenthesis, who he thought were, quote, capable of everything, end quote. Third, Trotsky had a preference, parenthesis, often, end parenthesis, for a flexible, non-linear approach to history, attuned to the complex ways in which specific political situations have been shaped by the combined and uneven character of historical development. I think these three qualities enabled Trotsky's, quote, global revision, end quote, which we can see as a series of radical shifts from the depiction of anti-Semitism as a feudal hangover to locating anti-Semitism at the very heart of modernity itself. From the uncritical celebration of assimilationism as the only acceptable answer to the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, to a chastened assessment of assimilation as historically bankrupt. From the rationalist and vulgar evolutionary form of Marxism that underpinned a remarkable complacency in the face of anti-Semitism, to a nonlinear Marxism able to grasp all that was specific to the emergency facing the Jews at mid-century. From the acceptance of the merely civic rights of Jews, what Norman Garris called Marxism's, quote, spurious universalism, end quote, to the embrace of the national rights of the Jewish people. From a reluctant acquiescence in the merely cultural expression of Jewish peoplehood, to the blunt acceptance of the necessity of the, quote, territorial, end quote, settlement of the Jewish nation in their own, quote, spot in the sun, end quote, as a, quote, compact mass, end quote. The revolutionary Marxist Ernest Mandel gave a qualified endorsement to Trotsky's global revision. Quote, among all the prominent Marxists of the Second and Third International, end quote, Mandel wrote, quote, it was Trotsky alone who developed the positive aspects of Rosa Luxemburg's and Engels' ideas into a less simplistic or less mechanical approach to the Jewish question, end quote. Mandel went on, quote, Trotsky's analysis of contemporary anti-Semitism and his recognition of the right of self-contained Jewish populations to a territorially and politically secure national existence constitute a coherent unity and a decisive step forwards in the Marxist attitude to the Jewish question, end quote. Ernest Mandel. That's a very surprising statement. It's a very interesting thing to think of, never mind. I don't know. But it's very interesting that he would say that. I didn't expect that from Ernest Mandel, because I know a lot of people who would be in Ernest Mandel's footsteps would not view the Jewish population as having a right to territorially and politically, quote, Jewish populations, who would not recognize, quote, the right of self-contained Jewish populations to a territorially and politically secure national existence. Although Trotsky never thought of himself as a Zionist, he had a fierce faith in the capacity of, quote, world socialist revolution, end quote, to solve the, quote, Jewish question, end quote. Trotsky became convinced of the necessity of a national solution to the problem of radicalizing anti-Semitism. Traverso notes Trotsky's always, quote, original attitude to the national question, end quote, captured in his 1950 statement that nations, quote, constitute an active and permanent factor of human culture, end quote, and his prediction that, quote, the nation will not only survive the current world but also capitalism itself, end quote. Parenthesis, quoted in Traverso. In Trotsky's later writings, we find him arguing that the Jews had every right to live in a, quote, compact mass, end quote, as a nation, in their own, quote, spot in the sun, end quote. In 1937, he predicted that, quote, the Jewish nation will maintain itself for an entire epoch to come. For Trotsky's biographer, the brilliant Polish socialist Isaac Deutscher, the Jewish state was a necessity. Though he opposed many of its policies, Deutscher supported its existence as literally a matter of Jewish life and death. He famously confessed that, quote, I have, of course, long since abandoned my anti-Zionism, which was based on a confidence in the European labor movement, or more broadly in European society and civilization, which that society and civilization have not justified. If, instead of arguing against Zionism in the 1920s and 1930s, I had urged European Jews to go to Palestine, I might have helped to save some of the lives that were later extinguished in Hitler's gas chambers, end quote. Deutscher went on, quote, for the remnants of European Jewry, is it only for them? The Jewish state has become a historic necessity. It is also a living reality, end quote. Deutscher. I think Deutscher is the author of another quote about Zionism that I think actually really hits the nail on the head. Maybe it'll be up in this, but I'm gonna say there's a quote. I think it's Isaac Deutscher, but I'm not sure. That he talks about how the way he thinks about he kind of sets up like a way of thinking about the Zionism, especially after the Holocaust, in the wake of the Holocaust. He says, what's he say? Imagine there's a man in a house that's on fire, and his entire family has died in this fire. And the fire's encroaching on him. And he jumps out the window. And he lands on it, but in jumping out, he lands on someone and breaks his legs. But the both of them are still alive. What is the appropriate relationship between the man who jumped out of the window and the person he jumped on top of? Like that kind of like thinking, I think, is very, very helpful in kind of trying to have like a rational view of Zionism and Israel-Palestine. Anyway, that last quote was from Isaac Deutscher. Back to the text. I think the other better post-Holocaust left has always allowed its thinking about anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the Jewish state to be radically impacted by that eruption of world history of which The Holocaust was the dark center. The socialist revolution in Europe failed. The revolutionary movement degenerated into Stalinism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis took power. European anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust, a rupture in world history while the wider world closed its doors. The Jews from the Arab and Muslim lands were brutally expelled in the 1940s and early 1950s. After a millennia of presence, which people like to blame on Israel. Israel caused the anti-Semitism in those countries. Like, fucking... When and what any other discourse would you apologize for a type of hatred based upon what, like that group or a certain of that group happens to do, right? Like, if you said, oh yeah, people hate this group because people from this group do this, so, like, that would be disgusting, right? Why would you say that kind of thing about Jews in Israel? Granting that you think that Israel is its very existence is as evil as you say it is. Anyway, Israel was created with the international and Soviet approval as a refuge state and as an expression of the Jewish people's right to self-determination. After that climacteric, the left should have been made a major reassessment. That much of it has not, blithely carrying on as before, preaching assimilation only, and opposing the existence of Zionism and the Jewish state, I do find remarkable. Philip Spencer. I am in full agreement with what you say about Trotsky, so I will only make a couple of additional observations. We need to say very clearly that there has been a widespread failure of many on the Trotskyist left to pay attention to what Trotsky was actually arguing and the way he developed his thinking. This is not a wholly new phenomenon in the history of the left. We saw this earlier in the way many Marxists after Marx regressed to exactly the position that Marx had come to criticize in his response to Bruno Bauer. It is true that Mandel and Traverso did recognize something of Trotsky's contribution to taking anti-Semitism seriously, but they were both pulled back to what we could call a pre-Trotsky position. In Mandel's case, this takes the form of a desperate attempt to claim that anti-Semitism is only one example of a much broader racism used to justify Western imperialism. This is at best a half-truth, and like other half-truths, when taken for the whole, can all too easily be deployed for anti-Semitic purposes. In this case, is a claim which can be used, as it now very often is, to provide a framework and excuse for many on the left to downgrade the significance of the Holocaust and the specificity of anti-Semitism. In Traverso's case, a recent book of his, which I viewed critically in Fathom, represents a serious regression from his own early work. Traverso now claims, echoing themes we first encountered in the Enlightenment, that anti-Semitism was a problem before, but it is no longer, with the obvious implication that Jews who go on about it now are being dishonest, engaging in special pleading, and setting their own interest against others who are far more deserving. New section. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Universalism can, quote, compress the particular like a torture instrument, end quote. Alan Johnson. You have praised the Frankfurt School critical theorists Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno for making, quote, the most significant contribution to our understanding of anti-Semitism from within the Marxist tradition, end quote. And here is this theme again. You suggest one reason was their willingness to critique the economistic Marxist orthodoxy about anti-Semitism, and like Trotsky, grasped that the eruption of Nazi eliminationist anti-Semitism into the world demanded, quote, a major reassessment not only of anti-Semitism but of the Marxist tradition itself, end quote. Fine and Spencer. In reappraising the legacy of the Enlightenment, I have always been struck by the power of Adorno's insight that universalism can, quote, compress the particular like a torture instrument, end quote. What can we learn from Adorno and Horkheimer? Philip Spencer. First of all, their willingness to rethink. They accepted that they might have been seriously wrong on an issue of major importance, with significant implications for their thinking as a whole. This is quite a rare phenomenon. The temptation for many of us on the left is to hold fast to an opinion in some way, especially as we get older. A fairly awful piece by Horkheimer appeared in 1938, The Jews in Europe, viewed Nazi anti-Semitism as a temporary secondary phenomenon, a, quote, safety valve, end quote. Its violence being, quote, aimed more at the spectators than the Jews, end quote. If anti-Semitism had any deeper significance, it had to do with the Jews' supposed role as, quote, agents of circulation, end quote. The analysis was reductionist and hopelessly inaccurate. This kind of reductionism is very common on the left even today. Other members of the Frankfurt School were equally dismissive, notably Franz Neumann, their acknowledged expert on Nazism. In his major work Behemoth, which came out as late as 1942, he assured his readers that the Nazis had no intention and would never, quote, never allow a complete extermination of the Jews, end quote. Neumann assured Adorno on the 14th of August 1940 that one could quite properly, quote, represent National Socialism without attributing to the Jewish problem a central role, end quote. Cited in Robenbach, 2001. Like Neumann, Horkheimer and Adorno were by now in exile in the United States. By reading their correspondence, and this was an eye-opener for me, you get a very clear sense of how shaken they were by what they were beginning to hear. In 1940, Adorno wrote to Horkheimer to tell him, quote, I cannot stop thinking about the Jews anymore. It often seems to me that everything we used to see from the point of view of the proletariat has been concentrated with frightful force upon the Jews, end quote. Horkheimer was afraid that, quote, nothing more remains for the Jews, end quote. See translation in Viggershaus. I think it's just Viggerhaus. I'm not sure. 1994. So they fundamentally revised their approach to an extent that seems to me to be indispensable for all of us on the left who come after the Holocaust. They now saw anti-Semitism as fundamental. Horkheimer wrote to the English socialist Harold Laski on the 10th of March 1941, quote, just as it is true that one can only understand anti-Semitism by examining society, it seems to me that it is becoming equally true that society itself can only be understood through anti-Semitism, end quote. To Adorno in October 1941, Horkheimer wrote, it is, quote, the focal point of injustice, ... where the world shows its most horrible face, end quote. The, quote, central injustice, end quote. From a universalist perspective, anti-Semitism is of decisive significance because, quote, whoever accuses the Jews today aims straight at humanity itself, end quote. And so, wrote Horkheimer to Isaac Rosengarten, quote, to protect the Jews has come to be a symbol of everything mankind stands for, ... The Jews have to be made what the Nazis always pretended they were, the focal point of world history. Quote, the Jews have become the martyrs of civilization, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno and Horkheimer also teach us that if we are to understand civilization itself, we have to trace anti-Semitism back to its origins. This does not mean that anti-Semitism is eternal and invariant, but that anti-Semitism has had many different aspects that have been articulated in different ways over time. In the final chapter of their major revision of the critical theory, the dialectic of enlightenment, they essentially produced a template for us to follow. Anti-Semitism is, quote, much more complicated than I thought, end quote, Horkheimer told Adorno. Horkheimer and Adorno realized that a host of factors had played a part in its rise. economic, sociological, political, cultural, anthropological, psychological, and so it is necessary to study each not in isolation, but in their, quote, constant interaction, end quote. Of course, all injustices should matter to socialists. We, or should be, universalists. If you care about anti-Semitism, it does not mean you do not care about anything else. That itself is an anti-Semitic charge, and the part of the framework of the Jewish question, quote, Jewish question, end quote. All forms of racism, for example, are abhorrent, but anti-Semitism is not only a form of racism, or, if seen as such, it has very distinct features, in that Jews are seen as not only inferior and subhuman, but also, unlike other racisms, all-powerful, demonic, and superhuman. All-powerful, demonic, and superhuman. One second. Horkheimer and Adorno get us thinking about the depth and complexity of anti-Semitism, how hopeless, even dangerous it is to reduce it to a, quote, effect, end quote, of something else, or to imagine it is only of passing significance, or to assume that it must have finally disappeared. Even after it had been radicalized to an unprecedented extent by the Nazis, it was unlikely to just vanish. Indeed, Adorno's research after the Holocaust showed how a new variant was emerging, in which guilt about what the Germans had done to the Jews was so unbearable that many projected that guilt back to the Jews. What Adorno was pointing to here, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote, has a significance which goes beyond post-war Germany. According to Wikipedia, secondary anti-Semitism is a distinct form of anti-Semitism which is said to have appeared after the end of World War II. Secondary anti-Semitism is often explained as being caused by the Holocaust, as opposed to existing in spite of the Holocaust. One frequently quoted formulation of the concept first published in Henrik M. Broder's 1986 book, Der ewige Antisemit, bracket, The Eternal Anti-Semite, stems from the Israeli psychiatrist Zvi Rex, who once remarked, quote, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz, end quote. The term was coined by Peter Schoenbach, a Frankfurt School co-worker of Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer, based on their critical theory. Adorno, in a 1959 lecture titled Was bedeutet Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, published in his 1963 book Eingriffe, Neun kritische Modelle, addressed the fallacy of the broad German post-war tendency to associate and simultaneously causally link Jews with the Holocaust. According to Adorno's critique, an opinion had been readily accepted in Germany according to which the Jewish people were culpable in the crimes against them. Jewish guilt was assumed to varying extents, depending on the varying incarnations of that anti-Semitic notion, one of which is the idea that Jews were and are exploiting German guilt over the Holocaust. Adorno wrote further, quote, sometimes the victors are declared to be the cause of what the defeated have done when they were still in charge, and for the crimes of Hitler those are declared guilty who acquiesced his rise to power, and not those who hailed him. The idiocy in all this is in fact an indication of something mentally uncoped with, of a wound, although the thought of wounds should be dedicated to the victims, end quote. Adorno. Initially, members of the Frankfurt School spoke of, quote, guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism, end quote, an anti-Semitism motivated by a deflection of guilt, the rehabilitation of many lower and even several higher-ranking Third Reich officials and officers appeared to have contributed to the development of secondary anti-Semitism. These officials were rehabilitated in spite of their considerable individual contributions to Nazi Germany's crimes. Several controversies ensued early in post-World War II Germany, e.g. when Konrad Adenauer appointed Hans Globke as chief of the Chancellery, although Hans Globke had formulated the Enabling Act of 1933, the emergency legislation that gave Hitler unlimited dictatorial powers, and had been one of the leading legal commentators on the Nuremberg race laws of 1935. According to Adorno, parts of the German public never acknowledged these events and instead formed the notion of Jewish guilt in the Holocaust. An alternative explanation was proposed for the spate of post-war anti-Semitic violence in Eastern Europe. In 1946, the Slavic writer Karel František Koch argued that the anti-Semitic incidents that he witnessed in Bratislava after the war were, quote, not anti-Semitism, but something far worse, the robber's anxiety that he might have to return Jewish property, end quote. A view that has been endorsed by Czech-Slavic scholar Robert Pinsent. It has been estimated that only 15% of Jewish property was returned after the war, and restitution was, quote, negligible, end quote, in Eastern Europe. Property not returned has been valued at over $100 million in 2005 dollars. Back to the text. Alan Johnson. How important was Adorno's willingness to use the conceptual resources of psychoanalysis, paranoia, repression, projection, delusion, aggression to explain anti-Semitism? Philip Spencer. Psychoanalysis was a very important resource for both Adorno and Horkheimer. Psychoanalysis helped Adorno and Horkheimer understand the irrationality of anti-Semitism and the unconscious, though not always unconscious, drives within the anti-Semite. What the Nazis feared, and they were not alone in this, was the supposedly immense power of Jews, not just in Germany but globally. Since this was nonsense, and was contradicted by the idea, held simultaneously that Jews were weak and pathetic, Adorno and Horkheimer realized the source of the fear must lie not in external reality, but in the minds of the anti-Semites. The hatred and aggression that are attributed to Jews actually reside within the anti-Semite. These and other feelings are so intolerable that they have to be repressed, but they also have to find an outlet, so are projected onto Jews. Of course, there's a level at which this is not always so unconscious. The Nazis claimed that the Jews were going to commit genocide against them, when they were of course planning to do this themselves. This is quite a common strategy in the history of anti-Semitism, by the way. Islamists today, and in this they are often excused or even supported by some on the left, claim that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, when it is obvious from their own words that Islamists themselves are the ones who harbor the genocidal ambitions. Adorno and Horkheimer are telling us that the Nazis were delusional. This is something that many, not just on the left, find difficult to deal with, because they think it somehow, quote, demonizes, end quote, the Nazis and is the opposite of a materialist explanation that roots Nazism and anti-Semitism more generally in objective circumstances such as the fact that Germany lost the war, or that the reparations demanded at Versailles were extortionate, or that inflation and mass unemployment helped the Nazis come to power. These are not unimportant factors, but they did not explain why the Nazis explained them as they did. These are not unimportant factors, but they do not explain why the Nazis explained them as they did, as the fault of the Jews. They also do not explain the madness of the Nazis and how that madness came to be shared by large numbers of people. So, you need to combine these ideas with other explanatory factors, as Horkheimer insisted. New section. Moish Pastone, left anti-Semitism is a, quote, fetishized form of anti-capitalist consciousness, end quote. New section. Many of us have been influenced by Moish Pastone's insights into the ways in which certain kinds of left-wing misunderstandings of, quote, capitalism and, quote, anti-capitalism can lead to left anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites, both from right and left, often have a picture of capitalism as, quote, Jewish, end quote. Both frame Jews as the personification of what's wrong with capitalism, rendering what is really an abstract and authorless system graspable because embodied. Because, quote, Jewish, end quote. The way some today rail against, quote, Rothschild capitalism, end quote, would be a contemporary example of this. The internet has made this problem much worse, but it's really only an updating of the German communist Ruth Fischer's instructing the German workers in the 1920s to, quote, hang the Jewish capitalists from the lampposts, end quote. Pastone has much to tell us about how left anti-Semitism can take the form of what he calls a, quote, fetishized form of oppositional consciousness, end quote. Philip Spencer. Pastone is a very important resource for a left that wants to take anti-Semitism seriously. Pastone was one of the first to identify the widespread failure of the German New Left in Germany to place anti-Semitism at the heart of its understanding of Nazism. It wasn't just that many saw anti-Semitism only as an epiphenomenon, but they then engaged in what he called a, quote, psychological reversal, end quote, updating in a way Adorno's earlier analysis of German guilt, to portray Jews as the new Nazis. Shockingly, this has become a quite common trope, not just in Germany, but more widely in the anti-Zionist world. His own analysis, in sharp contrast, anchored an explanation of anti-Semitism in his understanding of Marx, going back to the distinction the latter made right at the beginning of Capital between the two aspects of a commodity, the commodity's use value as something usable and tangible, and the commodity's exchange value, very roughly speaking, and this is a shorthand, its price in the marketplace. Pastone said anti-Semites tend to see capitalism not as what capitalism is, an abstract system. Instead, they personify it as, quote, Jewish, end quote. They make the abstract qualities of capitalism intelligible by personifying them. Capitalism is certainly intangible. Its decisions always seem to be hidden, but that's because, quote, they, end quote, are hiding them, says the anti-Semite. Capitalism is mobile, universal, and global, but that is to say, quote, they, end quote, are everywhere, alien to every place, nation, and state, says the anti-Semite. The process of personification is, according to Pastone, a prime example of what Marx identified as reification and fetishism, by attributing every bad consequence of capitalism to the wicked intentions and actions of a particular and tiny set of people, quote, the Jews, who are viewed as having astounding, superhuman, even demonic powers. The anti-Semite thinks they have, quote, explained, end quote, what is in reality a very confusing system, with no center but an impersonal logic by which we are all constrained. Pastone then explained different articulations of anti-Semitism in the modern world in relation to shifts in the capitalist mode of production. Anti-Semitism in each case presents itself as an explanation of everything that is going wrong, but as a purportedly anti-hegemonic resistance, it is at best a, quote, pseudo-emancipatory, end quote, politics, which is in fact not more remotely progressive. Contemporary left anti-Semitism is arguably making an even worse mistake. What we have now is anti-Semitism as the, quote, anti-imperialism of fools, end quote, in which a section of the left supports and condones a host of appallingly reactionary regimes and movements, many of them Islamists such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, but also other tyrannical regimes that are oppressive of their own peoples and anti-Semitic. Alan Johnson. Judith Butler infamously said that, quote, understanding Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, that are part of a global left, is extremely important, end quote. Judith Butler looks at the fascistic, but somehow sees something progressive part of the left. You can't really get more polemically disoriented than that. Politically disoriented than that. Philip Spencer. During the Cold War, a large part of the anti-capitalist left destroyed itself by uncritically supporting the Stalinist, quote, camp, condoning and excusing the misery and injustices to inflicted. But Stone argues rightly that today's idiotic form of anti-imperialism is even worse, because back then at least there was some connection, for a brief period, between the Soviet Union as the object of left-wing dreams and delusions and the goals of the left. Today, the regimes and movements making up the anti-Western camp have always slaughtered the left in their own societies, and always engaged in their own violent imperialist projects of annexation, conquest, and exploitation. Anti-Semitism is often the glue that holds these contemporary, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, alliances together. Behind the U.S. and within the U.S. lurks, for this section of the left and for their allies, the greatest enemy of all, the Jews. New section. Norman Garris. On Israel, quote, alibi anti-Semitism, end quote, and the Holocaust. Alan Johnson. Norman Garris was my tutor at university in the early 1980s and has been a major influence since then, though we disagreed about the Iraq War, which I opposed. In 2006, we both worked with him and others to create the Euston Manifesto, a statement of left principles which Norman pretty much wrote. Wikipedia on the Euston Manifesto. Or Euston Manifesto, seems like how it's actually said. The Euston Manifesto is a 2006 declaration of principles signed by a group of academics, journalists, and activists based in the United Kingdom, named after the Euston Road in London where it had its meetings. The statement was a reaction to what the writers argued to be the widespread violations of left-wing principles by others who were commonly associated with the left. The manifesto states that, quote, the reconfiguration of progressive opinion that we aim for involves a line between forces on the left that remain true to its authentic values and currents that have lately shown themselves rather too flexible about these values, end quote. The manifesto proposed a, quote, fresh political alignment, end quote, which involves, quote, making common cause with genuine Democrats, whether socialist or not, end quote, in which the left stands for democracy, freedom, equality, internationalism, the open source movement, and historical truth, while condemning all forms of tyranny, terrorism, anti-Americanism, racism, and anti-Semitism, including any form of it that, quote, conceals prejudice against the Jewish people behind the formula of, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, end quote. The signatories said they, quote, reject fear of modernity, fear of freedom, irrationalism, the subordination of women, end quote, reaffirm the ideas that inspired the great rallying calls of the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, liberty, equality, and solidarity, human rights, the pursuit of happiness, ... But we are not zealots, for we embrace also the values of free inquiry, open dialogue, and creative doubt, of care and judgment, and a sense of the intractable abilities of the world. We stand against all claims to a total, unquestionable, or unquestioning truth. Back to the text. Norman Garris once told an interviewer that, quote, I think of myself in the category of the, quote, non-Jewish Jew, end quote, discussed by Isaac Deutscher, end quote, but added that he'd ascribed to himself a quality often lacking in those listed by Deutscher, quote, a more particularistic concern for the future of the Jews, end quote. He was a supporter of the two-state solution, quote, Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike have a right to national self-determination, end quote. One contribution of his, made in an essay in Dissent in 2005, and regularly at his blog, was to identify those post-9/11, quote, reductions of the left, end quote, which contributed to contemporary left anti-Semitism. Parts of the left, he argued, have reduced world politics to a crude two-camp worldview, which meant that they had stopped attending to the nature of the perpetrators of terrorism if it was aimed at America or its allies. Quote, the weight and specificity of their religious outlook, of their political project, of the social values they represent, end quote, were excluded from left analyses. If included, it was only in passing. He called it, quote, throat-clearing, end quote, and was allowed no political weight. Garris believes these outlooks, projects, and values should have made clear to the left that these perpetrators were comparable not to revolutionary freedom fighters, but to fascists. Quote, it is worrying, end quote, he observed, that the left did not register, quote, blatant moral criminality fueled by religious certainty, end quote, as being, quote, a menace far beyond the cities of America and emergent out of whatever conditions, one antithetical to every ideal of its own, end quote. Garris. These reductions led parts of the left to believe that Israel had no right to self-defense against Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Instead, there was a quite ludicrous romanticization of such forces, who were courageously praised as, quote, for, quote, bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region, end quote, as Jeremy Corbyn did. Garris indicted a segment of the left and liberal opinion with routinely failing to oppose the, quote, indiscriminate murder of Israeli civilians, end quote, and failing to see that such violence was, quote, directed against the existence of Israel as such, end quote, and, quote, against Jews, end quote. Another contribution was his essay, Alibi Antisemitism, which argued that the relationship between Jews and the left was being undermined by a new climate of anti-Semitic opinion within parts of the left. But, quote, Israel, end quote, was being invoked, he thought, as an alibi to deflect the charge that there was anything of anti-Semitism at work. He gave examples of 4 types of, quote, alibi anti-Semitism found on parts of the left. First, the breezy dismissal of anti-Semitism as a, quote, understandable, end quote, epiphenomenon of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Second, as non-existent in the absence of clear and deliberate subjective anti-Semitic intent. Third, as mere programmatic rhetoric, also understandable, end quote, so not to be treated as in earnest, end quote. Lastly, as something one is politically obliged to turn a blind eye to. Parts of the left, Garris argued, were espousing a spurious type of universalism for the Jews, who were held to be, quote, special among other groups in being obliged to settle for forms of political freedom in which their identity may not be asserted collectively, end quote. So while he was a sharp critic of several Israeli policies, Garris believed that, quote, the absolute and principal precondition for a just solution of the conflict is the abandonment of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the dismantling of Jewish settlements there, end quote. And that, quote, the major responsibility for an initiative towards finding a solution lies with Israel, end quote. Garris distinguished legitimate criticism of that kind, whatever its fairness or accuracy in any particular instance, from the demonizing and dehumanizing animus directed at Israel by parts of the left today, which he thought was often of a plainly anti-Semitic character, relying on modern refits of old anti-Jewish stereotypes. When left-wingers protested that because they didn't hate Jews, as the Nazis did, nothing they said about Israel, Israeli Zionism, and Zionists could be anti-Semitic, Garris was especially impatient. At Normblog, he argued again and again that intention isn't everything. Sometimes, Garris pointed out, it's not much at all. Just a side note, I've probably said this in other videos if you've listened to my other videos that were pieces on anti-Semitism, that Cornel West, he was interviewed, it was an interview that I saw, but he's talking about Glenn Beck, and someone asked him if he thought Glenn Beck was a racist, and he said, I would say, he basically said that, like, he doesn't know whether Glenn Beck's a racist, but I think we can all say Glenn Beck is a racist, right? But he says that the policies and politics that he advocates, whatever their rationale, is disproportionately bad for black people. And since it's disproportionately bad for black people, the implications of the political values that he espouses, regardless of his intent or whatever language he may use or not use, is racist by default. So you don't have to go to and I think this is true of anti-Semitism. You don't have to go to make pornographic anti-Semitic claims about whatever, about Jews or about anything like that in order to advocate politics that are harmful to Jews. Anyway, where am I? Sometimes, Norman Garris pointed out, it's not much at all. Quote, "It is constantly surprising how stuck people can be over the view that racist prejudice is simply a matter of what one intends, and how stubbornly they resist the obvious truth that words and symbols carry meanings associated with their history and which cannot simply be disowned by declarations of goodwill." End quote. The absence of subjectively malicious intent is not decisive because, quote, "language doesn't fully belong to any individual user, even small group of users. Words acquire meanings and associations as part of a whole structure of usage, and you can't simply legislate away hateful connotations by declarations of intent." End quote. He gave the example of Steve Bell. The Guardian cartoonist who drew Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with a huge looming puppet master towering over and manipulating Tony Blair and William Hague, depicted as his glove puppets, as a classic anti-Semitic trope of powerful string pulling Jew, of the all-powerful string pulling Jew. Wikipedia says William Hague, born 1961, is a British politician and life peer who was leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2001. He was the Member of Parliament for Richmond Yorks in North Yorkshire from 1989 to 2015. He was in the Cameron government as First Secretary of State from 2010 to 2015, Foreign Secretary from 2010 to 2014, and leader of the House of Commons from 2014 to 2015. Hague was educated at Wat upon Dearne Comprehensive School, the University of Oxford, and INSEAD, subsequently being elected to the House of Commons at a by-election in 1989. Hague quickly rose through the ranks of the government of John Major and was appointed to cabinet in 1995 as Secretary of State for Wales. Following the Conservatives' defeat at the 1997 general election by the Labour Party, William Hague was the elected leader of the Conservative Party at the age of 36. William Hague resigned as Conservative leader after the 2001 general election following William Hague's party's second defeat, at which the Conservatives made a net gain of just one seat. William Hague returned to the backbenches, pursuing a career as an author, writing biographies of William Pitt the Younger and William Wilberforce. He also held several directorships and worked as a consultant and public speaker. William Hague was the first leader of the Conservative Party since Austen Chamberlain, 1921-22, to never assume the office of Prime Minister. After David Cameron was elected leader of the Conservative Party in 2005, Hague was reappointed to the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Foreign Secretary. William Hague assumed the role of senior member of the Shadow Cabinet, serving as Cameron's deputy. Following the formation of the coalition government in 2010, William Hague was appointed first Secretary of State and Foreign Secretary. Cameron described William Hague as his, quote, de facto political deputy, end quote. On the 14th of July 2014, William Hague stood down as Foreign Secretary and became leader of the House of Commons. William Hague did not stand for re-election at the 2015 general election and was succeeded by Rishi Sunak. William Hague was awarded a life peerage in the 2015 Dissolution Honors list on the 9th of October 2015. And Steve Bell, the cartoonist, Stephen William McLean Bell, born 1951, is an English political cartoonist whose work has appeared in a number of publications, notably The Guardian, from 1981 to 2023. Stephen Bell is known for his left-wing views. Bell angrily rejected the criticism, saying, quote, "I can't be held responsible for whatever cultural precepts and misapprehensions people choose to bring to my cartoon," end quote. Garris pointed out what was wrong with this response, quote, "He can be held responsible for the meanings widely attached to symbols he chooses to use. Where words, pictures, meanings are concerned, it isn't just up to him what these must signify for the rest of the world. He can confirm this for himself by drawing some other racist stereotypes than anti-Jewish ones in the weeks ahead to see what happens. It is, however, entirely common these days for anti-Semitism to be thought of as being in people's heads and nowhere else," end quote. All quotes from Norm blog. Norman Garris's anger at the Guardian newspaper went deep. Quote, "This once great paper of British liberalism now provides space on its opinion pages for the spokesman of Hamas, the contents of its programmatic charter notwithstanding, provides space on its letter page for philosophers justifying the murder of Jews, and provides space on its website for people who deploy well-known anti-Semitic themes, even while professing that they have nothing whatever against Jews," end quote. Norman Garris. The result of all this, Garris argued, amounted to a moral scandal, the return to respectability of anti-Semitic themes and ruses, quote, "within polite society and within the perimeters of a self-flattering liberal and left opinion," end quote. Philip Spencer. Norman Garris was probably the most important influence on me over a long period of time, especially his book on the Holocaust, The Contract of Mutual Indifference, published in 1998. So, The Contract of Mutual Indifference, Political Philosophy After the Holocaust by Norman Garris was published by Verso, and here's what the description of the book says. The author focuses on the figure of the bystander, from the destruction of Jews in Europe as well as to more recent atrocities, to consider the moral consequences of looking on without active response at persecution and great suffering. A powerful work of moral and political philosophy. The ideas which I shall present here came to me more or less out of the blue. I was on a train some 5 years ago on my way to spend a day at Headingley, and I was reading a book about the death camp at Sobibor. The particular, not very appropriate conjunction involved for me in this train journey, had the effect of fixing my thoughts on one of the most dreadful features of human coexistence, when in the shape of a simple 5-word phrase the idea occurred to me. In The Contract of Mutual Indifference, Norman Garris discusses a central aspect of the experience of the Holocaust with a view to exploring its most important contemporary implications. In a bold and powerful synthesis of memorial, literary record, historical reflection, and political theory, Garris focuses on the figure of the bystander to the destruction of the Jews of Europe, and the bystander to more recent atrocities, to consider the moral consequences of looking on without active response at persecution and great suffering. Garris argues that the tragedy of European Jewry, so widely pondered by historians, social scientists, psychologists, theologians, and others, has not yet found its proper reflection within political philosophy. Attempting to fill the gap, Garris adapts an old idea from within the tradition of inquiry, the idea of the social contract, to the task of thinking about the triangular relation between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, and draws a somber conclusion from it. Garris goes on to ask how far this conclusion may be offset by the hypotheses of a universal duty to bring aid. The contract of mutual indifference is an original and challenging work aimed at the complacent abstraction of much contemporary theory. It is supplemented by 3 shorter essays on the implications of the Jewish catastrophe for conceptions of human nature and progress and for certain types of Marxist explanation. Back to the text. The central thesis of the first half of the book has to do with the indifference of so many to the Jews in the Holocaust and what that tells us about the limits of and need for solidarity and about our responsibility to others not just in our own society but to others beyond the borders of the nation state. Its conclusion is clear and stark. If you do not come to the aid of others when they need your solidarity, you cannot expect them to come to your aid when you need theirs. That would be what he calls a, quote, contract of mutual indifference, end quote. If you are a socialist, that is fundamentally unacceptable, of course. But why then was there so much indifference, even on the left, to what was done to the Jews? Garris then goes on to address 2 closely related questions. The first concerns our political horizons, i.e. what we can reasonably hope for as socialists after the Holocaust. Garris argues that the occurrence of catastrophe means we have to rethink what is possible and desirable. We now live with the possibility of a catastrophic regression, and so, quote, a shadow stretches across the vision at the heart of the socialist project, end quote. We now know more about the capacity of human beings for evil, so we have to guard against it, to struggle to secure some basic minimum of security, freedoms, and rights for all citizens. This, quote, minimum utopia, end quote, should be the ground from which socialist efforts to go further than capitalism must take off. This is not an abstract question at all. There are states, largely in the capitalist West, for all the criticism that socialists rightly make of them, that have accorded these rights since the Holocaust. A simplistic and malign anti-Westernism aimed primarily at the United States and Israel as its supposed tool, or vice versa, he argued, could have grave consequences when it led sections of the left, as it has done, especially since 9/11, to condone or even support these movements in states which actually aimed to destroy precisely those states where those rights had been won. The second question has to do with the extent to which the attempt not just to take those rights away from, but to kill every Jewish person on earth, seems to have been unimaginable to so many on the left. I think it still is today, even though, or to go back to Adorno, precisely because it has been attempted, until I read Norman's book, I had taken for granted that there was a coherent and convincing Marxist account of in response to the Holocaust. To my great surprise, I found hardly anything, and what I did find was often dismaying, not least because so few on the left actually saw anti-Semitism as central to the Holocaust. Pastone had already pointed this out, but I hadn't properly read him at that point. If you cannot see anti-Semitism in the Holocaust, you are not likely to see it anywhere. If you cannot see how the Holocaust changed everything for Jews, you cannot recognize how they are actually sensitive to its reappearance and feel the need for a protection that wasn't there then, their own state, Israel. From Garris's perspective, we could say that this is a form or aspect of the, quote, minimum, end quote, that is needed after catastrophe. Final thoughts. New section, final thoughts. Philip Spencer. For me, all the thinkers we have been discussing provide support for a universalist, I would say cosmopolitan, politics grounded in solidarity with all suffering and injustice across the globe, including Jews. The universalism of some of the left today is both highly selective and toxic. Because it excludes Jews and casts them out as its criminal other, one of its most serious consequences is that it legitimates a particularly revolting argument that Jews are now the perpetrators of the very crime committed against them, genocide. The latter has, along with the issue of anti-Semitism, been the focus of my own work in recent years, and I see them as closely connected in at least two respects. The first is that genocide as the crime of crimes was first identified after and because of the Holocaust. It was the event that lit up the sky, as it were. So what happened to Jews did affect everyone, or at least everyone who was shocked by it. The second is that genocide is committed both against a particular group and against humanity. It has two sides, the particular and the universal. A universalism that only sees the latter is seriously flawed. It invariably downplays anti-Semitism and what was done to the Jews. It typically claims that too much is made of the suffering of the Jews, and that now, after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism no longer matters. This line of argument essentially re-articulates anti-Semitic tropes first visible in the Enlightenment, that Jews make too much of their suffering, that Jews going on about anti-Semitism is more special pleading, seeking to privilege Jews at the expense of far more deserving others, when anti-Semitism belongs only to the past, with the clear implication that if there is any anti-Semitism today, it must be because Jews provoke it. But the particularist converse, that only the Holocaust and anti-Semitism matter, is also seriously flawed, and can lead to the refusal of solidarity with those facing genocide, although as a matter of fact, this has rarely been the case. But to the extent that anyone does think like this, it does a disservice to the struggle against anti-Semitism itself, as well as to the victims of other genocides who all need solidarity because none can survive without help of others. None of this means that I do not see the necessity today for the state of Israel after the Holocaust in a world of nation states. In a world of nation states. The significance of that statement is considering that the nation state is the form of governance in this current juncture of modernity, the existence of a state of Israel, a Jewish state, remains necessary and legitimate. Given that the universality of the nation state in our epoch. That's what that means, at least according to me. But I do not think the nation state is the last word in political organization, and I think nationalism always has a powerful exclusionary dynamic. It always has the problem of who is to be included in the nation and on what grounds. All nation states have problems with this, so we have to find a way to go beyond nationalism and the nation state sooner or later. Doing so must start from insisting that we are part of one inherently diverse humanity, that we owe solidarity to any group within it which suffers injustice. But the history of humanity and of solidarity on the left is not a story of linear progression, and we need to think critically about how and why we have gone forward at times and backwards at others. Above all with the Holocaust in whose shadow we all now live. After that catastrophe, socialist hope cannot be the same, but if we do not hold on to the hope, then all we are left with is the shadow. Alan Johnson. I am pessimistic about the future of the radical left and so of its capacity to be the repository of that hope. Social democracy once thought the task of the left was not to trash the civilizational gains of the twin revolutions, industrial and democratic, but to preserve them, regulate and humanize them, and struggle to extend their best fruits to all, in the first instance to workers, women, and colonized subjects. And it looked not to middle-class, quote, activists, tenured radicals, or the churn of, quote, revolutionary, end quote, students, but to popular movements, trades unions, and mass workers' parties to be the core of a great international movement of rational reform. But since the disastrous anti-liberal and anti-democratic detours of Bolshevism, Stalinism, Maoism, authoritarian New Left Third Worldism, and since the innovations of postmodern, quote, theory and middle-class identity politics, I am not sure how much of that rational, serious, social democratic left remains. As for the social neoliberalism of the, quote, third way, end quote, it is proved to be more of an exit from social democratic politics than its renewal. Today, I see a radical left that supports or apologizes for violence against the West and the West allies, including violence from some of the most reactionary forces on the planet. So we get the radical left marching under the banner, quote, "We are all Hezbollah now," end quote, or calling Hamas, quote, progressive, or acting as lawyers for Putin or the Chinese Communist Party. I see a radical left that is in retreat to a time before social democratic mass politics, when middle-class utopian socialist sects dreamt of using a, quote, enlightened dictatorship, end quote, to impose from above their vision of utopia on the poor, benighted plebs below. I think we have that mindset, and those sects in new forms today. The older social democratic preference for reasoned critique, mass movements, and popular reforms is being replaced by a mostly worthless postmodern, quote, cynical theory, end quote, middle-class activism, and fundamentally dishonest politics of institutional capture and control by minorities rich in time and cultural capital. I see a rational materialist outlook giving way on the radical left to the extravagant belief that everything is, quote, culturally and socially constructed, end quote. The materialist left-wing philosopher Sebastiano Timpanaro Wikipedia says Sebastiano Timpanaro was an Italian classical philologist, essayist, and literary critic. Sebastiano Timpanaro was also a long-time Marxist who made important contributions to left-wing causes. He was an atheist. The materialist left-wing philosopher Sebastiano Timpanaro warned us back in the early 1970s, a half-century ago, that the left's war on materialism, its, quote, contempt for ... the ground floor, end quote, of our existence, i.e. its refusal to accept that human being is a, quote, biological being, end quote, not, quote, an abstract construction, end quote, was becoming, quote, increasingly pronounced, end quote, and this would not sustain a rational politics. How right he was. Who talks of Timpanaro today? Instead, I see the rise of three kinds of relativism on the left, each socially and intellectually the disintegrative. Epistemological relativism, quote, there is no truth, end quote. Moral relativism, quote, there is no right, end quote. And cultural relativism, quote, there are no cultural values or practices that are better than any others, end quote. Of course, each of these relativisms is strictly faux. The truths, values, and cultural commitments of the West are not granted equal, or indeed any billing. They are trashed. Quote, debate is hate, end quote. Quote, objectivity is a cover for Western subjectivity, end quote, and so on. Or they are imprisoned in sneering inverted commas. The universities are being turned by the left into sites of dull conformism, in which intellectual pluralism is cast aside in favor of new left orthodoxy. Dissidents are hounded. I just don't recognize any of this as leading to a just and free society. As for Israel, this new radical left treats it as an abomination, a, quote, white, quote, Western, quote, racist, quote, imperialist, or, quote, Nazi-like oppressor, part of or even the dark center of, quote, empire, with no right to continue existing. It either supports or will not raise its hand to oppose the many murderous anti-Semitic crimes of the world's only Jewish state. What the fuck I say? It either supports or will not raise its hand to oppose the many murderous anti-Semitic enemies of the world's only Jewish state. So if we want our course to be set on hope, we need a very different map than that being offered by the radical left today. I'm going to read through that's the end of the interview or the conversation, but I'm going to read through the references. Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. David Bankier, Ethos versus Expediency, German Social Democrats and the Jewish Question, in David Bankier's edited volume, Probing the Depths of German Antisemitism, German Society and the Persecution of the Jews, 1933 to 1941. Russell Berman, 2016, Misrepresenting the Trial, Judith Butler reads Hannah Arendt reading Adolf Eichmann. Daniel Blattman and Renee Poznansky, 2011, Jews and Their Social Environments, Perspectives from the Underground Press in Poland and France. From Bita Kozmala and Georgi Verbek's edited volume, Facing the Catastrophe, Jews and Non-Jews in Europe During World War II. Sam Bornstein and Al Richardson, 1982, Two Steps Back, Communists in the Wider Labor Movement, 1939 to 45, a study in the relations between vanguard and class. Jonathan Brent, Vladimir P. Naumov, 2003, Stalin's Last Crime, The Plot Against the Jewish Doctors, 1948 to 1953, published with HarperCollins. Jeremy Corbyn, 2009, video, Stop the War Coalition, Meet the Resistance, Jeremy Corbyn, MP, 3rd of March 2009, YouTube available at a YouTube link. Isaac Deutscher, 1968, The Non-Jewish Jew and Other Essays. Houston Manifesto Group, 2006, The Houston Manifesto. Robert Fine, 2007, Cosmopolitanism. Robert Fine and Philip Spencer, 2017, Antisemitism and the Left on the Return of the Jewish Question. Lars Fischer, 2017, The Socialist Response to Antisemitism in Imperial Germany. Norman Garris, 1998, The Contract of Mutual Indifference, Political Philosophy After the Holocaust. Norman Garris, 2000, Minimum Utopia, 10 Theses in Socialist Register. 2000, Necessary and Unnecessary Utopias, published with Maryland Press. Norman Garris, 2002, Marxism, the Holocaust on September 11th, an interview with Norman Garris. Norman Garris, 2005, The Reductions of the Left. Norman Garris, 2013, Alibi Antisemitism, which is on this channel. Jeffrey Herf, 1995's article, German Communism, the Discourse of, quote, Anti-Fascist Resistance, end quote, and the Jewish Catastrophe, end quote, and Michael Geyer and John W. Boyer's edited volume, Resistance in the Third Reich. David Hirsh, 2018, Contemporary Left Antisemitism. Max Horkheimer, 1989, or originally 1938, The Jews in Europe, and Stephen Eric Bronner and Douglas Kellner's edited volume, Critical Theory and Society. Max Horkheimer, 1996, he was dead by then, but it's Gesammelte Schriften, Volume 17, Briefwechsel, 1941 to 1948. Horkheimer and Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment. Alan Johnson, Book Review 2013, Book Review, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism. Alan Johnson on Garris's Marxism in Ben Cohen and Eve Gerard's The Norman Garris Reader. Quote, what there is there. What's there is there, end quote. In 2017, Alan Johnson, 2019, Leon Trotsky's Long War Against Anti-Semitism. Rosa Luxemburg, The Junius Pamphlet, 1915, The Junius Pamphlet, The Crisis in German Social Democracy. In Mary Alice Waters' edited volume, Rosa Luxemburg Speaks. Ernest Mandel, 1995, Trotsky as Alternative. Karl Marx on the Jewish Question. Kerry Nelson, 2014, The Problem with Judith Butler, The Political Philosophy of the Movement to Boycott Israel. Franz Neumann, Behemoth, The Structure and Practice of National Socialism. David Nierenberg, 2013, Anti-Judaism, The History of a Way of Thinking. Moishe Pastin, 1980, Antisemitism and National Socialism, Notes on the German Reaction to the TV show, Notes to Holocaust, which is a TV show, published in New German Critique. Moish Basson, 2003, The Holocaust and the Trajectory of the 20th Century, in Moish Basson and Eric Sontner's edited volume, Catastrophe and Meaning. Moish Basson, 2006, History and Helplessness, Mass Mobilization and Contemporary Forms of Anti-Capitalism, published with Public Culture, Volume 18. Anson Robbenbach, The Cunning of Unreason, Mimesis and the Construction of Anti-Semitism, and Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment. In the book, In the Shadow of Catastrophe, History in the Shadow of Catastrophe, German Intellectuals Between Apocalypse and Enlightenment. Joshua Rubinstein and Vladimir P. Naumov, 2011, Stalin's Secret Pogrom, The Post-War Inquisition of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Philip Spencer, 2012, Genocide Since 1945. Philip Spencer, 2017, Book Review, The End of Jewish Modernity. Philip Spencer and Howard Woolman, 2002, Nationalism, A Critical Introduction. Sebastiano Timpanaro, 1975, on Materialism. Enzo Traverso, The Marxists and the Jewish Question, The History of a Debate, 1843 to 1943. Enzo Traverso, 2016, The End of Jewish Modernity. Leon Trotsky, Thermidor and Anti-Semitism, published in 1937. Leon Trotsky, 1937 to 1940, on the Jewish Problem, excerpts from 4 statements. Leon Trotsky, 1905. Ralph Wigerhaus, The Frankfurt School, Its History, Theories, and Political Significance, and Robert Wistrick, 2012, From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel. That's the end of the references. Thank you so much for listening.